Today we're going to look at how to approach the longest type of answer on the Greek History Through Original Sources paper. That is the 45-mark question. I've selected one from the 2013 paper. What made the Athenian democracy so extraordinary were the opportunities it offered to even the poorest citizens. How far do you agree with this view? Now, the key here is the phrase, how far do you agree? You'll always get that in this type of question because what it's asking you to do is give two sides of the argument, and that is crucial for your 45-mark question. You'll also always get 3 bullet points, and they'll be requiring 3 aspects to your answer that you must include. The key word in the first bullet point is outline. Outline is all about giving information, telling them what you know about this topic. In this case, it's the opportunities offered to the poorest citizens. So we might call this context. See, the next bullet point requires you to include things that the sources tell us. Okay, so it's very vital that you actually refer to the sources on the specification. This doesn't just mean the writers, but actually some material within the sources. Finally, you must give some evaluation of the reliability of these sources. So you're not just going to use the information from the sources indiscriminately, but rather you're going to use it carefully by taking into account the possible motivations and background of the writers. A quick word on the difference between context and sources. Obviously, all our information about Athenian democracy, as any period of history, will come from sources. So you might think that this is a bit of a false dichotomy. However, what it's really asking us about is the sources in the spec is the sources we're talking about here, and the context is the rest of the information we have about the period and your general knowledge that could corroborate or contradict the sources. We might even include in context the interpretations of historians about these sources. Before we dive into answering, it's very important to think about the structure of this answer. It's a for and against type answer, and so what I must do is think about how the examiner reading my answer will be able to follow my train of thought. So there's really 2 possibilities here. You could either just split your answer into half and argue for and then against, with each paragraph a separate argument for or against, but keeping them all together. Or you could take a thematic approach and think about a number of themes and argue for and against within those themes. It's really up to you what you decide in terms of structure. For this type of question, I've gone for a thematic approach. Here I've got a quick planning grid. You can see the themes down this side. I've gone for 3 themes: the law courts, the council and the assembly. That's because it's generally argued that's where the influence of the demos as a whole rested in Athenian democracy. So it seemed sensible to have those as my 3 themes. And then I'm going to, for each theme, argue for and against. I've also got a little box here for reliability, just so that I take that into account in my answers. It's important to realise that this is meant to be a brief plan. I don't have very long to plan a question like this. A couple of minutes, just jot down. So long as it makes sense to you, that's all that matters. Here I'm going to be talking using the old oligarch and Aristophanes about the volume of work provided for the law courts and the fact that the juries were kept well supplied. And in the against column, I'm going to be talking about the domination of oratory and emotional appeals as evidenced by Aristophanes and Plato. You might think that I've only included 3 writers in here, but just remember that I'm only taking you through the first part of my answer, the law courts, and I would have brought more writers in for the other 2 themes. For example, I might be talking about the speeches in the assembly as evidenced by Thucydides and Xenophon. I've got a quick introductory paragraph here to show you. Now, it's not specified that you do have to write an introduction in this answer. Nowhere in the mark scheme does it indicate that, or the examiner's reports, etc., etc. However, I do think it's sensible, provided you keep it brief. You don't want a sort of summary of your whole answer in your introduction. And here I've just got two sentences, but they're really, really crucial for getting into the head of the examiner. I mean that in a positive way. Already showing the examiner I know exactly what I'm talking about. My first sentence, I tell him how I'm organising my answer, and I'm looking at the Law Courts Assembly and the Council. Immediately the examiner knows that I know how Athenian democratic institutions were organised and the importance of those three working together. So I've already showed him that I understand the demands of this question. My second sentence reads, the sources for 5th century democracy provide evidence for the role of poorest citizens, whilst also hinting at the limitations of the opportunities as well. I've got another sentence here. This time I'm indicating I understand the demands of this type of question. I understand that I need to use the sources to show that the statement is correct, but also to challenge the statement as well. The examiner therefore knows from just these two sentences that firstly I know exactly what I'm talking about, and secondly that I'm going to structure this answer in a way that will get me maximum marks. Now looking at the first main paragraph in my answer here, you can see how my plan comes into action. I've structured this paragraph using a PEEL structure, a point, evidence, explanation and link structure. Let's start with my point. Obviously it comes at the start of my paragraph, and my point is that the law courts were accessible and desirable for the poorest citizens because of Ephialtes' reform, 462-461. It's one of those key dates that's worth remembering, and that's because they received 2 obols a day, okay, state pay for that service. So it wasn't just constitutionally accessible, but also financially accessible for those poorest citizens. Now in the green is all my evidence from the sources. The first writer I'm going to mention is the old oligarch here, and he talks about a backlog of up to a year could occur in court. That tells me that there's a huge number of legal traffic, a huge amount of legal traffic going through the law courts. Okay. My other bit of evidence is that in the Knights, Aristophanes talks about how the Paphlagonian, that's a sort of thinly veiled allusion to Cleon, kept the juries well fed with court cases. So a good politician kept the juries going. Towards the bottom, I have my explanation. Now my explanation is crucial for linking all this evidence to my point. Okay, I'm really showing how my evidence supports my point. Okay, and my argument is that we can assume that the service of the jury would have kept the poor citizens in work, and this is because of the 2 obol pay, and therefore we can assume that because they're consistently being called into this capacity, it's a viable option for them. Finally, my last sentence is a link back to the overall question. Okay, the opportunities offered to the poorest citizens, were they extraordinary? Well, okay, the law courts gave a genuine role for these citizens. So I'm showing that I understand the question and referring back to it. Now looking at my arguments against, again I start with my point, and my point here is that, well, let's not forget about the role of oratory in proceedings, which might make us think that the poorest citizens didn't have as much influence in this role of democracy as might first appear. My evidence comes from Aristophanes, both the Knights, the Paphlagonian, obviously Cleon, and Cleon in the Wasps, talking about how that they could present arguments, presenting a case in a pleasing manner in the Knights, and his argument against Labies strangely convinces the audience. Okay, so he does convince the jury there. I've also then corroborated this with Plato. Okay, because he talks about the fancy language expected in the courts. That tells me that it's going to be a regular occurrence. And he also mentions about the sort of tricks played by the defence using emotional appeals. Okay, it's all about persuasion still. And so I've backed that up also with Aristophanes' depiction of Labies' children. Well, they're in fact puppies because Labies is a dog, brought to garner sympathy. Again, my explanation at the bottom is vital for showing how all my evidence is actually useful for supporting my initial statement. And the reason for that is that, well, we can clearly see that it's people like the demagogues, for example, Cleon, who are able to deploy these trained skills that not everyone would have. Not everyone would have the time for these skills. And so, because they're a key asset in the proceedings, therefore we must assume that this is an aspect of the law courts that the poorest citizens couldn't play a part in. And that's exactly what my link says at the bottom, which ensures that I then still go back to the demands of the question. Now that's taken you through the answer I'm going to show you for today. However, I'm going to go back through those two paragraphs again very briefly to just show you how I've also ticked off those 3 bullet points listed under the question that I talked about at the start of this video. And those were the fact that we require context, sources, and reliability. To start with context, that's the stuff in red that I've highlighted here. So you can see that first off, I've shown that I know about FELT's reforms in that year, and I know what the relevance of them is for this argument, i.e. the establishment of state pay. I've also, down at the bottom, talked about how this might have served as a pension for many citizens. Again, contextual knowledge that shows my understanding of these reforms and their significance in the argument. Sources I don't need to talk about too much because that's really just the information I've already shown you I've given, okay, from the old oligarch and the knights. But I want to point out how I've worked with some reliability. The first thing I do is I perhaps slightly challenge the old oligarch's statement by saying, well, perhaps he's showing the inability of the law courts because they are a democratic institution, and we know that the old oligarch has a disdain for democracy, being an oligarch, or at least we assume from his writing. So he would want to show the function as overworked because it therefore shows a weakness in the system. That is actually why, in my argument, I talked about the knights as well, because what I wanted to do was say, well, okay, we might challenge this, so let's see if we could corroborate it. So I gave some evidence from the knights as well, but it was important for me to question this also. Now, a lot of students assume that if you have to talk about the reliability of the source, that means tear it apart and really go to town and criticise it as much as you can. That's not really what we need to do here. We just need to show an awareness of why a writer might be suggesting this. Okay. So what I've done is I've said, well, Aristophanes is clearly using a caricature of his personal enemy Cleon, but I've also suggested, well, this could have been spun in a positive light. So if another writer had talked about this, it might have been said positively. So i.e. the fact that juries are well supplied, okay, that could easily come across in a positive way, and therefore I'm not really going to question Aristophanes here. Just to show you that I did the same in the second passage, okay, again I've got my context in red, okay, I've already initially showed them I know about the role of oratory in proceedings. I also know how the demagogues relied on these because of their lack of friendship circles, aristocratic friendship circles that is, and therefore that they required developing these, and that that the Athenian justice system relied on these trained skills. Again, I've already talked about the evidence I've supplied in this paragraph, but just to look at the reliability, okay, I have mentioned that Aristophanes might have been exaggerating when he talked about how Cleon's arguments were ludicrous and yet still won the day. But I have mentioned the fact that we might think this doesn't actually attack the argument I'm making, because in actual fact Cleon does convince the jury, and if the joke's going to work, it must be realistic. And so if Cleon never convinced any juries, then people wouldn't have a clue what Aristophanes was talking about. The actual fact is he did, so he must have actually been an effective prosecutor. I've also questioned Plato's reliability, because he clearly, as a disciple of Socrates, wants to show Socrates in a positive light, and he's trying to show how Socrates didn't use the fancy language of the law courts whilst everyone else did. But the exaggeration in Plato here is probably more likely that Socrates did use the language rather than other people didn't. So again, I'm not going to take this as going to bring my argument down so much. And finally, when I talked about how there was that emotional display, again, over the top, perhaps comic, but again, the scene must have been recognisable for the joke to work. So again, although I'm showing an awareness of the reliability, I am still making sure that my argument stands. Okay, I hope this video has been really helpful. I hope it's given you a clearer idea of how to maybe structure the 45-mark question and what each paragraph should include, and how maybe to use the sources productively in these types of questions. If you haven't already, it might be a good idea to see if you could complete this question and go back, watch the video again, pause it at relevant points when you're writing your answer, and plan how you might structure the for and against arguments for the poor citizens in the council and the assembly, and then you can compare it to my answers. Okay. Well, thanks very much for listening, and all the best.